everyone to our first, well, actually second SMA Awareness Month live. However, it is our first in August, as we had to start a little bit early. And this session is with Marion on equipment and SMA. Please share the live and comment any questions below, and we will answer them as we go. So over to Marion.
Lovely, thanks Marnie, thanks for all the help. Good evening everybody. We are talking tonight about equipment. Now that is particularly equipment. It's not about splints and orthotics, not about jackets and foot splints. It's very much about equipment. And I am going to split that up into 6 sections. So have a listen to the sections, because if you've got questions, you may want to keep them for when I do that section. So I'm going through the body. I'm starting with lying, sitting, standing equipment, and then we're going to go to mobility, which covers an enormous amount of equipment, including car seats. We're going to talk about home, manual handling, and transferring equipment. And then the last lot of equipment will be anything you might use at school or work. So those are the 6 groups of equipment. Those are the main groups, but within that there is an amazing amount of stuff. Obviously, if you need equipment, you need to speak to your local OT. Some places it's the physio that gets it. But if you want information, if you want help, there is only one real organization you need to go to. Now, some of you may remember there was an organization called the Disabled Living Foundation, and they used to have a branch in every big city, and it was a government body, and they would have this place where you could go and be assessed. You'd arrange an appointment, you'd tell them what you wanted, whether it was wheelchairs or bath aids or whatever, and you'd go and you'd see them. Well, obviously the government pulled the plug many, many years ago. They're now a charity, and they only work out of one centre in London, but they're web-based. And if you contact them at this web address, dlf.org.uk, with concerns, for information on any piece of equipment, you can email them, and they will send you an amazing amount of unbiased information. They are supported by no particular company. So anything that they recommend or tell you about is researched rather than supported by the company that makes it. So if you're really stuck and you don't feel the piece of equipment you have is right, or you want to buy something, get advice from them first. When it comes to buying privately, be careful, because if you find a disability shop in your local area, you may want to support them, but on the other hand, you will find a lot of their prices incredibly inflated. And what you should do then is look at the prices and then check them online. Because if you've tried equipment in one of these disability shops, you should then try online and have a look and see if it's much cheaper online, because in some cases it really is. So let's start with children. Some of this will be relevant to adults as well. It's not specifically aimed at children, but obviously the bulk may well be for children. But this advice is based around equipment for everybody. Now, the first thing we're going to look at is lying. And to be honest, I am not the biggest fan of sleep systems. And the reason I don't like sleep systems is because it's fine if the child or young adult or adult sleeps in the same position all night and is comfortable, whether they are on BiPAP or not on BiPAP. If you spend your whole night on your back or on your side and you can cope with a sleep system, absolutely fine. But if you're the sort of person that needs turning in the night, or your child needs turning in the night, then sleep systems are impossible, because not only do you have to undo the sleep system, but you then have to reposition the sleep system, which takes quite a lot of time. And it's this inability of a sleep system to be moved quickly that makes it difficult. Quite a lot of the children find them quite hot. The SMA children are generally sweaty bunnies, and they don't like to be too hot at night, and many of them are quite hot. Now, with many things, sleep systems originated in cerebral palsy to try and keep these children straight and symmetrical during the night. And that is a positive aim of a sleep system, to keep you symmetrical. But if it keeps you symmetrical in bed and you're relaxed and you're floppy, as you usually are in SMA, even if you have contractures, it really is not relevant to have a sleep system if you are then not in a good position when you are sitting during the day. The other thing is jackets at night in bed. If you are wearing a jacket at night in bed, we do not recommend that, and I'll tell you why in a minute. But again, a jacket and a sleep system do not really go together. You shouldn't need both. So if you wear jackets or you wear splints, then splints, jackets and sleep systems aren't really compatible, because in theory they're both trying to do the same job, so it's a bit of overkill. Now, we have never, in all the 30 years I've been doing this, from Hammersmith to Great Ormond Street, we have never recommended jackets in bed. And the reason that we don't do it is we do not believe that the scoliosis in SMA is affected by the lying position. The vast majority of children's scoliosis is what is known as idiopathic. It is not known why it happens. It happens differently in boys and girls. It can happen as young as 2 years old, and it can happen as late as teenage. And you develop this asymmetry where your muscles are normal. This is the difference. In idiopathic scoliosis, there is no underlying muscle condition. And what a jacket at night is doing in idiopathic scoliosis is helping you to grow straight, because it is known that you grow most in bed at night. So what it's trying to do is take that growth and keep it straight. But that is not the same as SMA, where the vast majority of scoliosis is caused by muscle weakness, which is not an issue when you're lying down. And that is why we particularly have never suggested wearing a jacket 23 hours a day. Now, if your local service does, then you need to go by your local service. But if you have a jacket that you are wearing at night in bed, then using a sleep system, as I say, is counterproductive, because they're both trying to do the same thing. So as I say, I'm not the biggest fan of sleep systems. Some children get on with them. Children who sometimes have pain at night, hip pain or leg pain at night, may benefit from a sleep system. But my preference is something called an E-roll. And an E-roll is exactly what it suggests. It is an E shape. It is 3 pieces of foam sticking up to keep your legs basically going down 2 grooves, and that stops your legs falling out. It keeps them reasonably symmetrical. Obviously, they need to be fairly fitted. And these are made by a company called Mattress Supports. And that is the website for Mattress Support, mattresssupport.co.uk. You can give that to your OT. They do more than just E-rolls. They do T-rolls and other things to sleep at night, but they're not total sleep systems. So they're not as hot, they're not as difficult to change, and they're one piece. You don't have to use them necessarily at night in bed. They can be used in a sitting position. So it's worth looking at the Mattress Supports if you're having difficulty with positioning at all. So one of the issues that we have with lying, and particularly with the weakest of children, babies and adults, is the head falling to one side, either ear down towards your shoulder or rolling with your face one way. And what you then need to consider, and this is from babies up to adults, is a neck pillow or a head support. And what you get is a little pillow, and it's almost flat and it has a dip, particularly for babies, to keep their head in the middle. Or you can have one of the little travel pillow style things to put around your neck to stop it falling to the side or rolling. And that's quite important, because if you get shortening on one side of your neck, not only can it pull your face down, but obviously if you have tightness in your neck, it will have a knock-on effect on your spine. And if you find that the child or young infant or baby is only achieving a semi-reclined position or lying, and that's in the most severely respiratory compromised people or children, that you still will find that your head will fall sideways, and so you need some neck support. Now, I don't use collars very often, and that's not for lying anyway. But what we're saying is that when you are lying, if your head's constantly falling to one side, then you do need a support to keep it in the middle. And the beauty of the neck supports is it doesn't restrict your movement too much. You can still turn side to side, but try and stop that tightness developing at the side of your neck. So that's lying. There's not an awful lot to say about it. Obviously, if you are spending a lot of time lying, be you adult or child, you want it comfortable. And there is a basic piece of equipment that has gone out of fashion, which is very unfortunate because it's one of the very, very best pieces of equipment, and that is a sheepskin blanket. Sheepskin is cool, even though it's sheepskin. It helps air circulate, so that's why it's cool. It's soft, it prevents pressure areas, and it's a really nice surface to lie on. So if you have a child or an infant, or sometimes bigger adults who are really uncomfortable in the reclined or lying position, then sheepskin is what you should be on. And it's not, if you can get hold of real sheepskin, so much the better. If it has to be synthetic, it's synthetic. But if you can get hold of a sheepskin, then that is a really lovely, good old-fashioned washable surface. It can be cleaned, a really nice surface to be on. And it's one of those unfortunate things that some of the best ideas are still very old-fashioned ideas. And when they go out of fashion, people think there must be something wrong with it. There's absolutely nothing wrong with sheepskin. It is a lovely, lovely surface to be on. You can have the same in sitting. If you're uncomfortable in sitting, if you're very sweaty in sitting, you can sit on a sheepskin as well, or have a whole sheepskin cover on your wheelchair. And as I say, sheepskin is lovely, it's cool. Obviously, if you've got molded supports or whatever, it does have to fit well, but that is something that you can use in sitting or lying. Okay, now sitting is a very, very big topic. And if we start with infants, one of the things that everybody wants is to get their child sitting. And that's one of the first developmental milestones that everybody recognizes as important. And obviously, if you are a type 2 or stronger, then you will achieve the ability to be sat. And the reason I say to be sat is that there is a difference on sitting someone and them getting themselves from lying to sitting. So the ability to sit is the ability to be seated, as opposed to get into sitting, which is a much more advanced function. So it's all very well being able to sit, and many children, and it's perfectly natural, will sit on the floor, sit and play. And the problem is we then end up with our legs splayed out for a bigger surface to stop us falling to the side, and a very kyphotic posture. And it's really something that's quite difficult when the weaker children get this very hunched-shouldered, round-backed posture and find it very difficult to extend up straight. And one of the worst things that we can do for a child who's getting quite kyphotic is leave them sitting on the floor. And the reason that we have all this problem, and I need Ike to help me with this one, when you are in the upright position, your hamstrings are in a shortened position. And in that position, they can pull your pelvis backwards. When you are sitting in that position, Your hamstrings, which are strong in SMA, are in a lengthened position. And if they don't like it, the way that they are going to reduce that is by bending at the knees, usually in the twisted outward position. So you end up with your legs twisted out and your trunk and your pelvis is pulled backwards to take the stretch off this part of the hamstring here. So your pelvis pulls backwards, and to balance, you counter it with the top of your trunk rolling forwards. And this is when we end up in this horrible kyphotic posture, this rounded back posture with our knees bent, usually with our legs rolled outwards, sitting on the floor playing. And everyone thinks that it's great to have the child sitting. And actually, if they are in this kyphotic posture, it's not a positive. It really is not a positive. And the way to stop that is to get them off the floor. Now, we're not saying necessarily on a seat. It can be on one of these floor sitters. These are a bit dramatic. This is a squiggle system. We don't need pommels in them, but we want them off the floor, and we want a wedge or a little cushion under their bottom to take the stretch off hamstrings, to stop the pelvis being pulled backwards, to stop that upper trunk being pulled forwards. And it's really quite effective. Just to put a cushion or a wedge under their bottom allows them to sit up much, much straighter. Now, obviously, if you've put them on a cushion, it's not quite as easy to get to your toys. So then you have to think, if you're going to have one of these systems, if your OT has given you something like this, or even your physio, you must have a table to go with it, because if you don't have a table and you've still got your toys in between your legs, it's totally, again, counterproductive. If we want you upright, we want you sitting with your shoulders back and your trunk up as straight as possible, you need a table or a tray to play on. Now, you can have a lap tray, one of the little beanie trays, and that for little children is enough. But if it's not, then they need to give you the table as well. And most of these seating systems have a table or a tray that goes with them. So if you have an infant or child who's sitting in this awful kyphotic posture, sitting on the floor, get them off the floor, even on a little cushion, a little wedge, or into a seat system that has a raise under the bottom. Do we have any questions, Marnie?
Yes, we've got a few. I'll go with the ones for now on the topics you've talked on. Does tummy time help? And if so, what does it help most with? Okay. Now, a lot of children with SMA do not like tummy time for several reasons. The first one is that it can restrict the diaphragm, and the diaphragm is the most important muscle of breathing in weaker children with SMA. So if you are having tummy time and you can't breathe because you're flat on your tummy, then you are not going to be a happy baby or infant. So tummy time only works when you know what you're doing. And a lot of physios have blanket tummy time, force the children onto their front and think that that's the way to do it. And it's not. Now, if any of you know Chiara Mastella, who's a very well-known physiotherapist from Italy, she uses a system of bean bags to lie the children on to allow them to get tummy time. But they have to be on these bean bags. They're horseshoe shaped so that they allow a gap under the diaphragm to allow the children to breathe. So that's really important. You cannot put any SMA infant, particularly the weaker ones, on their tummy if they find it difficult to breathe. So you either have to have these horseshoe shaped bean bags that Chiara herself makes, or she can show you the pattern for them. I do actually have some. And that is a useful way of doing tummy time.
But the other problem that these children have that a normal child does not have is an inability for quite a long time. And sometimes the weakest children do not get this ability to lift their head when they're on their tummy. So if they're face down, they often can't turn. And that's positively dangerous. You do not want to put a child face down if they can't turn their head. So that's important consideration. The next thing is, what are you going to do with the head? Do you want them over a wedge? And I'll just get my dolly. So you can put them over a wedge and they can hang their head down. If you have them on a wedge, we're back in the situation where all the pressure is through their chest, making it hard to breathe, and their head is down and it's very hard to get up. So unless you have the arms forward where they can help use their arms to push their head up, then you're going to have a lot of difficulty. So you really need to be aware of what you're doing when you're doing tummy time. Now, we always start tummy time with the infants on a ball or a peanut, because you can be in recline rather than flat, so that you're starting lying in recline. And that's very often what parents do themselves when they have them here on their chest, which is another way of doing tummy time. You yourself can be lying back, and it's much nicer to do this as tummy time than have them flat, because this is the same idea. They're on their tummy and you're trying to encourage them to bring their head up. So you can do tummy time on yourself. You can do tummy time across your body, across your knees, and help them that way. So you don't need a lot of equipment to do tummy time. But we usually do it on a ball or a peanut, where they're not flat, they're angulated on the ball or peanut, and then you can turn them sideways as well to give them room to breathe. So tummy time is fine with the bigger, stronger children. It is fine for exercise, but it's not fine just to leave a child there and hope that it'll learn to lift its head or push on its arms by itself. It really has to be well done to allow the child fun and play and a positive experience, rather than a negative experience where it's just they are very, very unhappy and spend the whole time crying, or sort of crying, because the very weak ones don't even cry that much.
Okay, another question is, what is your opinion on the self-turning mattress systems?
It's hard. I mean, I worked at Stoke Mandeville, so I'm very aware of the turning beds. Because all the paraplegics and tetraplegics used to be on turning beds, and some of the turning beds just tip you, and a turning bed is not a piece of equipment for a small child. Turning beds are enormous. They're full-size beds, they're quite wide beds, and they can be in 2 sections or 3 sections, so that you're on your back and then one side lifts and you're on your back and then the other side lifts, or you're pretty much in the middle and the whole lot tips and tips. Some people like them, some people don't. They're bulky, they're noisy. Some people would prefer the profiling beds that will tip you up and then sit you. But the turning beds, you really do need to try one to see if it works. Again, you've got to consider whether you're on BiPAP or not. Is the machine going to be compromised? Where is the machine in relation to the bed? Is the tubing over the side that's being turned? Is it getting caught? So what I am very keen on with turning at night is that it's as quick as possible. Because when you are turned at night in bed, and when you're turned frequently, child, infant, adult is awake, and the person turning you is awake. Turning beds, I don't think, are the answer, except really for adults who are, to be honest, quite heavy and would be difficult to turn without the use of a turning bed. I don't think it's for light people who can be turned quite quickly, and I don't think it's for children. I think it's really for the heavier adult.
Okay, we've got another one. Parents saying their child likes to lay with their knees up, as when their legs stretched out, it hurts their back. but they're worried about this making knee contractures worse. Is there anything they can do to stop the contractures but provide the comfort for the back?
I think this is a big problem because hip flexion contractures, unfortunately, have a bad impact on the knees. You can have straight knees and tight hips, but what happens is once your hips are bent, your knees have to be bent to go somewhere. So if you're lying down, let's get some arms out of the way. If you're lying down and you're trying to lie flat and you've got hip flexion contractures, you are going to end up in that arched position. If you try and straighten the knees, the more you try and straighten the knees, the more you get that arch, and that's what's uncomfortable. So in theory, you need to start with the back straight and then bring the hips to where they'll go. But then you've got the knees trying to do something different. And if the knees are hanging down, then your hips just end up higher. If your hips will go straight, but your knees won't, then you're in the same position. So sometimes the best solution for this is a small roll under the knees, not a big one that's going to push the hips up. Again, if you can get one that is measured to the person or child, so that it's just the right height. The other nice thing about a roll is if it's the right height, it can keep the heels off the bed, because often what happens is either the legs roll out, which you don't want, or if you try and keep them straight, all the pressure then goes through the heels, which if you're wearing night splints is uncomfortable. So sometimes a small roll under the knees allows for a small hip flexion contracture, a small knee flexion contracture, and allows the back to be straight. So a little roll, now it could be a rolled up towel, a rolled up bath towel, rolled up bath sheet, it could be a rolled up blanket, something just under the knees. Now that sounds as though it's going to make contractures worse, but if you're then going to end up with your knees up in the air or out, rolled out to the side, because that's the only position you can get comfortable, then it's a bit of a trade-off. But the best solution is the one that keeps you back fairly straight and your hips and your knees in the best possible position. There are times when you find that the best thing to keep the hips straight is to have the knees in that position. But how do you do that on a bed? You can't, unless you're going to go to the end of the bed and hang over the edge, which wouldn't be comfortable. So unfortunately, as I say, it's a bit of a trade-off because of the knees and the hips sometimes wanting to do different things. So if we go for the best possible option, it's a small bend at the hips, a small bend at the knees with support under the knees. And that stops the legs rolling out as well. Now there is another piece of equipment called a T-roll. What it has is it's T-shaped. It has a bit that either pokes up or forwards to stop it rolling out from between your legs, but you don't need anything quite that sophisticated. As I say, sometimes just a rolled bath towel or bath sheet or even a blanket under. People still have blankets. Do they have blankets? Just under the knees here to allow the least possible bend, but the most comfort. And again, sleeping is about being comfortable. And while night splints are an issue, it's not a talk tonight about night splints. You know, if you're not going to sleep, then sometimes you have to compromise. And sleep is important for everybody.
Okay, thank you. Next question is, do the sheepskin fabric prevent the pressure relieving qualities of mattresses and seating working as they should?
It depends on what sort of seating and pressure relief system you have. In theory, it shouldn't, because it's just allowing a layer of air in between. The cushion, such as a J cushion, it shouldn't, because it should be evenly spread, and it's the contouring of the cushion that makes a difference. To be honest, I would say a RoHo, it possibly, it may not be as flexible as a RoHo. In a molded seat, it shouldn't make a difference because molded seats are quite rigid. In a memory foam bed, if you have a memory foam mattress, it may well have an effect on the memory foam. But one of the things with sheepskin is that it will conform to the shape of the body. It's not rigid. So in theory, all you're doing is like a sheet, putting something in between you and the memory foam. So it shouldn't have a big effect. And the best way to do it is to find out. But in effect, apart from a Roho cushion, I can't see that the sheepskin would cause a lot of problems with pressure relieving mattresses.
Okay, and we'll do this one and then move on because the rest will be more relevant to what's coming up in the talk. Is how do I encourage my bottom to sit on both bum cheeks evenly?
How do I, sorry, can you say that one again, Marnie?
How do I encourage my bottom to sit on both bum cheeks equally?
You can't. One of the big problems we have about asymmetrical bum cheeks is that it's more than just your bum cheeks. We have many, many children and adults who have a favorite bum cheek, to the point where sometimes one bum cheek is totally unused. And what I normally say to the kids is, if you're really not going to use it, you could sell it. Now we have a problem with asymmetry of bum cheeks. And let me just use Dolly to show you. If you are sitting all on one bum cheek, let's say we're sitting all on this bum cheek and this one isn't, what is happening, and you can see from the zip in a way, is if I am sitting on that, while it's fine, if I am just leaning, that's not what happens in the norm. What happens is I sit on this bum cheek, but my spine will curve, quite nice that zip actually, my spine curves to keep my head in the middle. So I'm sitting just on this bum cheek, but everything else has gone wrong. There are situations where you can try and straighten the spine and bring both bum cheeks in line. And the best piece of equipment to do that, unfortunately, is a spinal jacket, because it straightens the spine and it lifts you so that your weight is up and more symmetrical. If I just try and push you onto the other bum cheek, what happens is I am sitting all on my left bum cheek. Somebody comes and pushes me onto the right bum cheek, and I end up, my whole trunk and head feel as though they're falling to that side, and all I'll do is compensate with my head the other way and twist. So that it's not easy to say, just move over to both bum cheeks. If you have a seating system that can help you, that's fine. But strangely enough, if you pull somebody up by the head, you will find that their bum cheeks often get more symmetrical. The weight bearing gets more symmetrical. But you can't just lift somebody up by the head the whole time. Now, again, if you have ever seen Chiara's work, in the little type 1, she does actually have them suspended with traction of the neck. And it does help not only the neck movement, but it helps the spine and the pelvis become more symmetrical. We try and use spinal jackets. But the problem with seats, I'm sitting more on that bum cheek, so I'm tipped. And this bum cheek is hardly sitting on the cushion, and this one is putting a lot of weight through the cushion. If you ever look at your cushions, and this is interesting because the number of times I take a cushion out of a wheelchair, strip it down, and nobody's looked at it for years and years. And apart from all the rubbish that's in there, you will find that the gel pads have exploded, or the gel pads were never right in the first place, or things have gone completely askew. Nobody's looked at them. Now, what I can do is I can do one of two things. I can push the pelvis to try and equal it up. So in other words, I'm lifting that side to push over that side. But the problem then is, what is the rest of my body doing? The alternative to pushing that side of my pelvis, just pushing across, is if I am sitting all on this bum cheek, is to build up under the other bum cheek with gel pads or foam, so that the weight bearing is going more through both bum cheeks. So you have a choice. You either shift the weight more equally, and to be honest, a spinal jacket is as good as anything at doing that. If you're older, it may not work, or if you have either a rubbish jacket or that's not what you've got, then that might not be an option. But it's not a case of just what's going on at the pelvis. You have to look at what's going on above it, and even sometimes below it with the knees and hips, so that you can either push up on one side or build up on the other. And sometimes you have to build up on the other, because if you push on one side, everything goes even more wrong. So that needs a good OT, a good assessment, or somebody who knows what they're looking at when they're looking at you sitting. Now, what we do when we're assessing cushions and seating is we like to take the cushion out of the wheelchair and sit the children on the cushion and see what's going on. See what we can move, see what we can adapt, because sometimes it's not what's going on under your bum. It may be that you need thoracic pads to hold you one side or another to stop you leaning to one side. So it could come from thoracic pads. It could come from your backrest and how symmetrically you're being held from behind, or how tight your backrest fits around you. So it's not just a case of looking at a bottom. One of the big things about sitting and seating is it's not just about your bum. It has to work at every level, including your feet, where your feet are, because a lot of people who have back pain, when they have their feet on a step or something, if they don't sit well in the chair and they have to come forwards to get their feet on the floor, then there are back problems. When you are sitting properly, with your feet on the foot plates or on the floor, with your knees and hips in the right position, with your bottom equal, your spine well supported, and your head in the middle, then you can get a good sitting position. That's not always achievable. It is a compromise, but it's got to be somebody who knows what they're doing. It's got to be somebody who's prepared to look at every aspect of bum, feet, hips, spine, head. It's a combination of everything. It's not just about what your bum's doing. But in some people it can be corrected, and in others it cannot. And you have to compromise by padding, lateral support, trunk support.
Okay, thank you. We've got a couple on spine and spinal jacket. Do you want to do that now, or do you want to move on and then answer those?
I think it's one of those other situations, Marnie, where this topic has got bigger than we expected.
Yeah.
It might take more than a week.
I'm going to an appointment with my son tomorrow to get casted for another spinal jacket, as the one they made him doesn't work for him and hurts him. Is there anything I should be asking for? My son is top heavy and has curvature of the spine.
Well, it's interesting because I was contacted by a parent recently, and it really surprised me that the first thing was that the jacket didn't have a tummy hole. That's the first thing. In SMA, all jackets should have tummy holes because you are diaphragmatic breathers, and the tummy needs to expand to allow the diaphragm to push downwards and get the maximum air into the lungs. If there's nowhere for the tummy to go except underneath the jacket, then the jacket's never going to work properly. That's the first thing. There should always be a tummy hole. The next thing is that the jacket should be waisted. It should not look straight up and down. If it's straight up and down, then it's not doing anything but holding you from side to side, and it's not correcting, it's not lifting you, which is what you want. As I say, if you pull your own head up like this, you will sit up straighter. Even if you grab your own head, you sit up straighter. I'm not saying that we should all go around like that, but actually it's quite bizarre that if you lift your head, your body will straighten up a bit. So you need to be lifted, and you lift with a spinal jacket by having a waist contour that sits on the pelvis and then pushes the spine up from there and holds it as straight as possible. A jacket should correct. It should correct the weight bearing, and it should correct the posture. Unless you already have a fixed spine, and then a jacket's a bit of a waste of time, you should be able to get correction in the jacket, comfortable correction. Now, the jacket shouldn't be so long that it's digging in your thighs. It shouldn't be so high that it's up under your arms. But what's also really important about a jacket, and we've totally got off the subject, is that how it's put on. because it should always be put on in lying. You can put it on in sitting, but then to fasten it, you should be lying. It should be pulled right down into the right place on your pelvis so that the waist contours actually sit just above your pelvis. Bottom strap, top two straps, and then to sit up. When you have a spinal jacket on, you should always sit up with your knees bent. And the reason you do that is if you just sit up, then your stomach contents can be pushed below the jacket and the jacket is pushed up under your arms. If you bend the knees up when you sit up, then there's nowhere for the stomach contents to go and you do not get that lifting of the jacket under your arms. So even if the children have their jackets adjusted at a lunchtime at school, it should still be readjusted and put back on lying down. So you need to think, does it have a tummy hole? Does it actually have waist contours or is it straight up and down? And does it correct? Now, most jackets fasten at the front and that is how John Florence make them. I'm not saying personally that that is the only way to make them. Two-piece jackets, a front and a back tied together, is never going to give the correction that a one-piece gives. There are some one-pieces that fasten at the back, but they should still have a tummy hole at the front, and they should always be comfortable for 6 to 8 hours. And again, they need to be comfortable without riding up under the arms, without the child disappearing, and should, as far as possible, equalize the weight bearing. So that's jackets, which is totally off the subject. But what is important about jackets is that jackets and molded seats do not go together. Again, there is no value in having a jacket and a molded seat. A molded seat should be doing what a jacket is doing, not quite as well, but it's more for the children who cannot tolerate a jacket that they have a molded seat. There is no reason why a child should have a molded seat and a jacket if the jacket's doing the job properly. So that's an important feature. And if you have a good spinal jacket, you may not need a lot of extras in your seat. A cushion, obviously, that is comfortable for as long as you're going to sit in that chair. Some people sit in different wheelchairs, some people sit in different chairs. They have manual chairs, they have electric chairs, they swap about. They get home, they sit in on the corner of the settee, which they should be shot if they're there for more than 30 minutes. Then they should go to the opposite corner of the settee. You should never, ever be slopped in any position for more than 20 to 30 minutes. Don't care how you sit in, as long as you change it regularly. So jackets can be worn in and out of a seat, but if the jacket and the seat are not compatible, then that is another problem. And you have to look at the seating when you're looking at the jacket. So if you get a new jacket and you have a wheelchair, you need to make sure that the two go together. And that if you've got a particular contoured cushion, that the jacket fits in it. If you have lateral support, you've got to get the jacket to fit in it. So it's not just always about the jacket. It may be the seats you're sitting in. Is it suitable for the seat that they have at school? Is it suitable for like a squiggle system? Is that what you're using? So you have to think about the jacket as more than just a piece of equipment you stick on the spine. It needs to be fitted into the context of sitting and seating. Any more questions, or we'll continue with seating?
Move on to seating, because a few questions have come through, but they're relevant to seating. So okay. You may answer.
So there's a couple more things that we need to consider about sitting and seating. Now, when we come on to mobility, we'll talk about wheelchairs and the seats in the wheelchairs. I particularly want to look at sitting and seats that are not wheelchairs at the moment. And another seat that children spend a lot of time in is obviously the car seat. And this is the bane of a lot of people's life, because good car seats are exceedingly expensive and some charities will help to fund them. There are quite a lot of car seats, and obviously one of the better ones is the one from R82, where the whole lot swings out so that you can go in straight, because there is a lot of problem with parents hurting themselves trying to get children into car seats, wiggling them into car seats, whatever. So that obviously the car seat that swings out and you can go in straight is a much better car seat, but they're incredibly expensive. The other thing that you want with car seats is recline, which is quite a difficult feature to get, but it's important, particularly for the children whose head falls forward. And if you have a child whose head falls forward, it makes it incredibly difficult to put the child in the back seat of the car and you drive if you think that you're going to have to keep reaching behind you to push the child's head back. And that's not feasible. So that either you get a reclining wheel car seat, or you at that point need to think about a collar if the child is constantly falling forwards. It's fine if it's to the side because you can again use one of those travel neck pillows and that will stop them falling sideways. But if they fall forwards, and obviously that can include breathing as well, then you need to think possibly about a collar. So wheelchair car seats are a big problem. Now, jackets and car seats should go together. If you wear a spinal jacket, you should be wearing it in the car, particularly on a journey that's more than about 15-20 minutes. Because one of the things that kids love doing in the car seat once they're comfortable is falling asleep. And once you've fallen asleep in a car seat, you will fall to one side. So if you do wear a spinal jacket, ideally you should be wearing it in the car seat. And then again, you need to make sure that the two are compatible, that if you've got a jacket, that it goes comfortably. Not only that, that transfers into that car seat with the jacket on are easier, because if you're trying to get a child into a car seat and you're having to twist and hold the spinal jacket and stop it riding up, it can cause a lot of aggro. I appreciate that. But it's something that you need to consider. If we're trying to keep these spines as straight as possible, if we're not rodded with growing rods, and then some surgeons want the children to wear jackets anyway, or more so with growing rods, then you need to think about the car seat. Again, the DLF is a good place to go to for information on car seats, but they are incredibly expensive. And beware of all second-hand equipment. If you buy it on the internet, even if you get it from another child, you know the family, hunky-dory, you're good friends, you can invalidate the guarantee if you pass it from one family to another. So you need to be aware of what is going on in terms of any adjustments, different children, changing things from one place to another to make sure that it is safe for your child in your situation. Again, hopefully you have an OT who understands the needs of these children, and you can get the OT to give you some help, information, come and see you at home, come and see the difficulties or the lifestyle that you have for which the seating fits. Now, there are seats like the Trip Trap chair, which are very nice as a high chair. It's a nice sitting chair as long as you get the support with it. It grows, which is nice. You just need to make sure you never, ever let the child put their feet on forwards. But there are some nice seats around that are more universal. Again, high chairs are an issue. What do you feed the children in? Should they just be sitting in their wheelchair all the time? Is it nice to come to the table with everybody else? Do you not use a table? Well, that's fine. A lot of people these days don't even use a table. But if you do, you know, it's quite nice for the children to be sitting at the table with you. It may be that you want to transfer into a seat, and how are you going to have a seating system that goes into your seat? Or, as I say, there are the Trip Trap style chairs. IKEA used to do them. I don't know if they still do. That's the one that looks like a triangular frame, and then it has steps going down that you can adjust so that you have one horizontal section for the seat and then another horizontal section for the feet. Again, as I say, they can tip. So it should be a tip trap sometimes if you stand on the front, but they are nice. They can have a bar across the front, and they come, because again of the sloping shape at the front, they will come nicely up to a table. So it is a nice way of getting a child to a table. If you are a family who uses a table and the wheelchair doesn't fit the table, or they're lower or they're higher and are not sitting with everyone else. So that sort of trip trap seat. Now what we are going to do is the equipment that I've mentioned, I will give Marnie all the details. I'm writing everything down that I'm talking about, and we will put this all together if people want the information on where to get them and what the equipment is. So the other seats that we need to look at are the ones that they use more in the sort of this sort of seating system, where you may have one of these things at home. I know a couple of type 3s who've been given these, which really probably aren't necessary. They can sit in most seats. But if you're going to get something like this, can you please get one with wheels on so that they can be moved around and you're not constantly transferring them in, out, into their wheelchair and out. So if you're going to get this sort of seat to be given at home for them to sit when they're not in their wheelchair, then get one with wheels. And that's very much the same for school. There are Pea Pods. We don't usually recommend Pea Pods except for the weakest of children. It's really not necessary. And again, they're quite difficult to hoist into and certainly hoist out. And I know there are a lot of parents out there listening to this who think, who hoists in and out of a chair? Well, I am not saying who doesn't, because the majority of you don't. But actually, you should be hoisting everywhere, so end of that one. But we need to think about what we're sitting in. So if we spend time sitting on the floor and we're getting this curved posture, we need to be off the floor, even if it's on a cushion or a wedge. Ideally, if you have a little seat like this that they can sit and play with a table, brothers and sisters and their friends, that's fine. If they've got a little wheelchair, that's absolutely fine. That'll work. If you sit or transfer your child, or your type 3 comes and sits down and squishes into the corner of the settee, 30 minutes, and they either get up, they move around, they change chairs, or they sit in the opposite corner of the settee. One of the problems with a lot of the seats is they have straps everywhere. They're actually built to hold you in one position. Children are moving creatures. You look at a child, there are studies, there's a beautiful study that looks at the movement of some infants around a room in a play area. And they are constantly moving. They move something like 1,600 times in a couple of hours around a room. Children do not keep still. They are not still creatures. They move, they wriggle. And even when I'm in a room full of adults, if I ask them to sit straight at the beginning of a talk, within 2 minutes they've moved and they've crossed their legs and they've uncrossed their legs and they've moved one in front of the other and they've sat to this side and they've sat to that side. We move. We don't like to keep still. And yet we tie children into these positions and we think we should get them sitting straight and keep them wherever. And actually, I like movement. I like them to move, but I don't like them squished in horrible positions. So while we don't want them stuck in beautiful positions the whole time, because that doesn't move their muscles or move their joints or move anything else, we don't want them sitting squished in horrible positions for long periods of time. So if you want to sit in a nice comfortable seat, great, but move. 30 minutes, 20 minutes, move. We all move. So these kids have got to move. You don't want to plonk them in the corner of the settee. 2 hours later, they're still in the same position, because you can guarantee it is a horrible position. Great for 20, 30 minutes. Don't care. Horrible position. Fine. Go and find another horrible position that's completely opposite, completely somewhere different for another 20 or 30 minutes. Now that sounds like a pain. And yes, it is. But that's the choice. You either keep moving, or if you're going to keep still, you keep still in a nice position, which is much more boring and much more fixed and difficult. Okay, that's as much as I want to say on seating for now, Marnie. So let's take some more questions on seating.
Okay, we've got one. Is a pea pod bad for scoliosis?
A pea pod is not really a child's chair with SMA. It's an infant's chair. And while it's great for SMA 1, it shouldn't be bad for scoliosis, because they are reasonably firm and they should be fitted to each individual child and they can be adjusted. it's not a seating system of choice. And it certainly shouldn't be something that an older child, and certainly a more functional child, should be sitting in for a long time. There are plenty of nice, relaxing chairs that can be used without using a Pea Pod. And the other thing about a Pea Pod is they're quite reclined. So, you know, your view is really sort of upwards towards the ceiling. You're not sitting upright facing forwards, which is a much less functional position. We don't work, we don't rest. Even if your settee has a nice high back, you're not here unless you want to spend your time staring at the ceiling. So Pea Pods are great for relaxing, they're great for the less mobile child, but I wouldn't necessarily use a Pea Pod for an older or more functional child.
Okay, we've got one. I'm going to ask this because it's linked to scoliosis, even though it's a tiny bit off topic, but it is an important question to ask. Is it possible to keep scoliosis flexible?
Yes, it's undoubtedly possible, but it doesn't work for everyone. We have children who, we had one young man, probably about 4 years ago, he had spinal surgery. He was about 14 or 15, and you could get him up under his arms and raise him up. And it was like a concertina. He sat as a squished, I mean, he probably got 8 inches of height from spinal surgery, which actually is functionally is really difficult. Because one of the problems is if you're here and your hands are to your mouth and you can scratch your ears and pick your nose and scratch your head, that's fine. And then to straighten you up and your hands are here and you can't do anything. So there are problems of straightening up. But yes, you can keep a spine flexible, but not in every case. And the times that it is less possible is when you have rib rotation. And the ribs and the vertebra don't grow at the same rate, the same pace, and they aren't, it is very, very hard to get a spinal jacket to correct the ribs, because the spinal jacket is just keeping the vertebra straight. It is not actually working on the ribs. And it's the rib humps and the rib rotation that often fix the spine. And that is the problem when you have a very rigid spine. And it's not, SMA is not the worst situation for rigid spines, believe me. Congenital muscular dystrophy is far, far worse, far younger, lot of tightness of the muscles, as well as scoliosis. The muscles are very fibrotic. But if you stretch the spine, if you exercise the spine, if you swim, if you do stuff where you're moving a lot, moving symmetrically, lots of rolling, you can keep mobility in the spine. But that doesn't mean to say you're going to keep it straight. There is a vast difference between a mobile spine and a straight spine. So a lot of the more mobile spines are actually very curved. As I say, concertinaed, it's like squishing down, but you can pull up and can pull up straight. And we had a little girl last week, and when I pulled her up, I was really quite surprised by how straight she could get when you saw how wonky she was in sitting. But on the other hand, we had another young lady who was really quite twisted in the thoracic spine. The ribs were twisting, giving that awful rib hump at the back, and that is much, much harder to straighten up. So if you don't have the rotation, yes, you can keep your spine more mobile, but if you've got that rib rotation, and that often is unavoidable, nobody is going to blame you if you've got it, it happens. You know, scoliosis happens, rotation happens, different shapes. You can have a C curve, you can have an S curve, you can have your neck can curve into the scoliosis. There are all sorts of things that can happen. Somebody who has bad scoliosis doesn't necessarily mean they've got bad parents or had bad seating or bad physio or whatever. It just means they've either grown quickly or got very asymmetrical power, or it's just the way that the muscle pull has pulled their ribs round rather than their lower spine. We can't always know. We have children with high curves, we have children with low curves, C curves, S curves, twisty curves, so that the best curves that often correct the best are either the C-shaped curves where you just can lift them up, or the mild S-shaped curves, but once you get rotation, much, much harder.
Okay, we've got another one, and this is from someone who is 16 with type 2, asking, can seating, sorry, I'll start again. With seating, can too much support cause damage and make you weaker? For example, lateral supports.
It really depends, and I know where the question's coming from, and I understand, because there are situations where you think, well, if you're going to wear a spinal jacket all day, you're not going to use your spine muscles, you're going to get weaker. This is why we try and keep the jackets for part of the day. So only the worst spines, the very worst spines, and when we say the worst spines, what you have to think of with scoliosis and seating and jackets is that the worst spines are the ones that are progressing the fastest. It doesn't necessarily mean the worst curves. You can have a 40-degree curve, but if it doesn't change for 2 years, it's not a problem. You can have a 20-degree curve, but if a year later it's a 45-degree curve, that's much more of a problem. So it's the rate of progression that decides how bad a curve can be. If it's taken you 10 years to get an 80-degree curve, that's totally different from getting an 80-degree curve in 5 years. And having rotation or not having rotation, or having a big curve in one part, or having the S-shaped curve, which has 2 parts to it. And again, I understand where that is coming from. Now, normally with jackets, we would say that we want the children out of the jacket and doing as much as possible at their busiest, most effective time. So we tend, most people put the jacket on in the morning, go to school, come home in the evening, tired and floppy, take it off, bleh, onto the settee. We want it the other way around. If you're busy and you're active and you're feeling your strongest in the morning, don't put the jacket on then. Move then. Do your exercises then. Do your moving then. Do your swimming then. And then when you're tired in the afternoon, because we know SMA children fatigue, we know SMA adults fatigue, we know even type 1 babies fatigue. Fatigue is an issue. So that if you're tired and fatigued and floppy and falling asleep, then you use your jacket. Lateral supports should not be totally controlling you. Lateral support should just be stopping you from sort of listing to one side. A lateral support is not a spinal jacket, and it's not a seating system. It's literally just there to guide you into a more symmetrical position. So a lateral support on its own should not stop you. And there again, if you're 16 and you haven't had spinal surgery, if you're a girl, or even if you're a boy, if you're 16 and you haven't had spinal surgery, the likelihood is you have got away with it, which is pretty remarkable, because it's got to be the tiniest percentage of people who have not had scoliosis surgery by the age of 16. On the other hand, if you have had surgery and you're asking about post-surgery, then the lateral supports make no real difference, because basically your surgery is your scaffolding, and that's what's holding you up, not the lateral supports. But in terms of actually, will lateral supports make you weaker? No. But if you've got a really supportive seating system and you're there all day and you're relatively young, somewhere between 4 and 12, and you're really not doing any exercise that allows you to move your trunk around, then yes, like with everything, the less you do, the more likely you are to lose it. And that's particularly true of lockdown, as we know, because you're not swimming, you're not doing a lot of the sports and activities. Those of you who horse ride, those of you who swim, who haven't been able to do it. Yes, of course, lockdowns had a really, really bad effect.
Okay, we've got another one saying, would you have a joystick of a chair at full extension of the arm if strength allowed it?
No, because if you've got full extension of the arm, the likelihood is you're going to be pushing yourself into that sort of posture. There is no value of having the joystick as far away as possible. The joystick should be at a comfortable position. It's like a steering wheel. You don't drive your car with your arms fully extended. Why would you? It's not a comfortable position. It's not a functional position. It's quite a tiring position. And you don't have the amount of control there that you do here. What you've got to remember is when your arm is straight, you're having to work the shoulder and the elbow as well as the forearm. When you are here, you have a lot more control because you only have to do the forearm and the hand. You don't have to control the shoulder and the elbow. So no, I wouldn't have the arm extended. As I say, you wouldn't drive a car extended. You might on a bumper car ride at a fairground, but otherwise you have your hands here, so you don't have to work your shoulders and your elbows. You're just really using your hands and your forearms to do the work. So no, I wouldn't want to be in an extended posture for a joystick.
Okay, we've got another one saying a parent who's struggling getting their child in and out of the car seat. However, they're worried that the child is still too young to be travelling in their wheelchair in the car. Is there a specific age where it's safe for them to start travelling in their chair?
Well, there's several issues about travelling in your wheelchair, and that is whether the wheelchair is supportive enough, whether it's crash tested, and whether it actually fits in the car and can be clamped down properly. So I think this is an issue. It's not always the age of the child. I think there are other issues. One is recline. And what your chair is. Are we talking about manual chairs? Are we talking about electric wheelchairs? Does the wheelchair recline? What's the best position for it? I do think that there is a case for traveling in your chair, but you've got to be comfortable. It's got to be well supported. It's got to be that the child is functional and strong enough to go over bumps in their chair, to if your chair gives you a lot of movability, if it's not really that well supportive because you don't need it, is that enough for when you're driving, when they're tired, when they relax? Are they getting enough support? But the main thing about driving in whatever position is the head control and the head position, because the trunk should be in a good position in the electric wheelchair or manual wheelchair. It's about what the head's doing. And if they can support their head and they can manage in a vehicle, in the car, if you take your wheelchair in the car, they've got to manage their head. And if they've got a weak head and the wheelchair is not going to support that, then no, they need to be in a car seat. But again, it may be that you need to have that position assessed by an OT. And it's easy for me to talk from here. I'm nowhere near you. I can't see your vehicle. I can't see your wheelchair. I can't see your car seat. You need to try and now, lockdown has not helped anything in terms of equipment. We're not getting equipment. We're not getting adjustments for equipment. A lot of people have had equipment delivered and not had it put together because nobody will come to the house and do it. So lockdown has been a disaster when it comes to equipment. But get your OT with their visor and their mask on and have a look, because it's very easy for me to say things from here, but I can't see what's going on. I can't see the child. I can't see how strong or weak they are. It really needs the OT to come and help you make those decisions.
Okay, we've got another parent asking about how you said when they put the spinal jacket on, you need to sit them up with their knees up to stop the stomach dropping, and how you can do that when hoisting.
Well, in a hoist, in theory, you shouldn't be hoisting into the jacket. So if you're lying down, you're putting the hoist on. When you bring them up to sitting in the hoist, you should still try and keep the knees up. Now, you may say that that's not possible in the hoist, but actually it is, because that's the way we do it when we put people back into their wheelchair, when we take them out in our department. So if we take them out with their jacket on and we put the jacket back on to get into the wheelchair, as we're hoisting them up, and it depends whether you're hoisting them up from lying or sitting. If you're hoisting them up from sitting, it's not an issue because you've already brought the knees up to sit them up. Sometimes what you need to do is bring them to the edge of the bed. Now, I know in the home situation, it's not that easy because sometimes you have to swivel around. If you swivel around and bring their legs to the edge of the bed, what you then do is you do a sort of all-in-one where you bring them up and the legs go down over the edge of the bed as they come up. So you've brought the knees up, they're swiveled, the edge of the bed's here, and you've got the knees up, and as you come up, then the legs can go down over the edge of the bed and then you can hoist from there. So that's much easier than trying to hoist in the long ways position if you twist them around and hoist them up from there. But there shouldn't be a problem because the hoist in theory can bring the knees up as it's bringing the back up. But it is possible, because that's the way we do it when we get the kids back into the chair, when we get them out in our department.
Okay, I've got another one. My daughter's toilet seat arrived and it's not fitted. She leans to one side but cannot go to the toilet in her spinal jacket. Will this be okay?
Yes, because you're not on the toilet all day, hopefully. You can't be on the toilet for that long. The only problem is if you're taking it off to toilet, which is a bit of a pain, I accept, then again, you should in theory be, hopefully it's all hoisted and set up, but you know, not everybody is. And obviously if this webinar is going to other countries, there are many, many places where, you know, we complain about what we get in the UK, where people have nothing compared to what we have. I know there's other countries where they have everything compared to what we have, but you know, we can't complain as much as we do. We like to complain, but then we need to know what other people are doing. But ideally, if you are hoisting your child on the toilet, which you should be, again, when you put that jacket back on, it needs to be done properly. This is the problem, but there's no issue about not having the jacket on the toilet. That is not a problem at all.
Okay, I think we can move on to the next bit.
Okay, we're getting late on time and we're only just getting to standing. So we're about halfway through, so we've really got a bit of a problem. I think we're going to have to come back to this one, Marnie, because I'm not sure that we're going to get to the, I mean, wheelchairs will go on forever, because wheelchairs, mobility is not just about wheelchairs. Okay, now I want to talk about standing. For small children who have the power, standing in a standing frame is passive. That does not mean not to stand them in a standing frame, but they are not doing anything standing in a standing frame. So for our children, as anybody who comes to Great Ormond Street knows, we either stand them in gaiters or we stand them in CAFOs. Many of them will stand in a standing frame as well, but we want them in CAFOs to be working their trunk, working their pelvis, working their legs, even working their shoulders, working their arms, working their head, because standing in a standing frame is passive. If you are tied into something, you are doing very, very little. So standing in a standing frame is passive. It's very important, but it's passive. It gets you upright, which is fine. It stretches your knees, your hips, your feet, which is fine, but it's passive. And I'm not into passive. I'm into standing in standing frames, but only when the child is able to be doing some freestanding as well in whatever. Now, there are 4 types of standing frame. I would say the good, the bad, and the ugly, and the dynamic, but it's not quite that simple. But the 2 types of standing frame that children with SMA should be using are this one, which is the supine stander. And this is the one that starts off in lying and then comes up to standing. And there is this one, which is the upright stander. Now, there is a big problem with the upright stander. If you have a child that can't stand, it is very difficult to get them into an upright stander, because you end up, and the best way of doing it actually is to be kneeling. And you are kneeling, and what you do is you are kneeling and you have the child sitting on your knees. And then what you do is you put the feet in the thing and then you put them into the standing frame that way. And that is the best way. You should be kneeling with the child sitting on your knees, and then you can bring them up from there. And that's a good way of using an upright stander. Now you can see that child is far too big to be on anybody's knees. And these are really, really difficult to use with a big child if you do not, you have a hoist, or if the wheelchair doesn't come up to stand, or if there is not some way of getting a child in. Now that looks very simple, but actually that's almost impossible. I mean, how do you get a non-standing child into that position? Not easy. So supine standards are by far the easiest to use, but again, they're very, very passive, even if you come upright. Now this thing is a prone stander. And as you can see, you are virtually lying on your tummy and bringing your head up and resting on your arms. I do not like prone standards for SMA. These are for cerebral palsy. You're not fully weight bearing through your feet because, as I say, you're taking some of the weight through your tummy. You have your head is not in line with your body. If I draw a line, which I will, except my pen's not working, which always happens, isn't that typical? So that is in line. So you can see the child has got to have their head up the whole time. They are resting on their arms. This is not the position you want to be in an SMA. You should be upright. Now, this is not the nicest standing frame in the world. You need to find something. The only nice thing is it has a table. This is not nice, but you've got to find something that's easy to get into. This is for the weakest of children. It's the easiest one to use, the supine standard, or the tilt table, some people call it. And it's fine, but it is not quite as good a position as this one. But my favorite for anybody who has any arm power is this thing. And that's a dynamic stander. And basically it means it moves. Now these move because they have wheels on the bottom. But this moves because you are pushing it. And if you can push, if you have any arm power, this particular model is the Riften. That I will tell you what Riften looks like. And Riften is not cheap and Riften is not popular. That is Riften. That is the Riften one. This is the one we have, that I have in my team. I love this one. Now look at those wheels. Those are very, very easy to push, and those are what we should be having on all the kids' manual wheelchairs if we're expecting them to push. This is the angled wheels, or some people call them the sports style wheels, and these are by far the easiest to push. They shouldn't be straight upright, they should be angled, very easy. The support is at the front, but they are taking weight through their feet. This is actually a child in our dynamic stander. There's a pad at the back. They're not that difficult to get into for a small child. And then you can get a lower piece. This is quite high, but you get a lower one to make it for a taller child. And then they can push themselves around. So they're actually doing something. They're mobile, but they are mobile themselves. And this is by far our favorite type of standing frame, and that is a dynamic stander for any child who has the arm power to push. And because of these angled wheels, it is not the hardest thing in the world to push. So those are the 4 types of standing frame that we like. Marnie, any questions?
We've got a few. Just find them. 1 second. Okay, I think this one kind of just ties in with what you were on about the dynamic standard, saying, what's the best standard if you want a child aged 6 on treatment to start using their muscles? Currently using dynamic standard, but I want her to use more of her body.
It's very hard for a child who's standing to use more of their body in any sort of frame. If you want them to use more of the body, you've got to get them out of a standing frame and into CAFOs or gaiters and actually get them moving. Now, I know that I can have a lot of tomatoes and rubbish thrown at me for saying this, but virtually all our type 2s and now several of our type 1s are in CAFOs. Yes, that doesn't mean to say they're all going to walk. That doesn't all mean to say that they're all going to be incredibly brilliant in them. But we don't know until we've tried them. We love them because it gives them mobility, it gives them stability, it gives them dynamics, it gives them work, it gives them fun. They can stand, they can move, they can stand at standing trays. They don't have a great big piece of equipment in front of them. They've got to move, they can wiggle, they can dance, they can balance. There is so much positive in CAFOs or gaiters. Gaiters are really for the lighter weight children. There is no problem with having gaiters for a lot of the children, but obviously with CAFOs, you can bend the knees, you can sit them down in them. They don't have to take them off, put them on, take them off every time they want to stand and sit, stand and sit. It's more support around the ankles unless the child has ankle splints, and then the gaiters are fine because they'll go down and give them ankle stability. But for a child who's got no ankle splints, sometimes you can get a little boot to give the ankle stability, but if the ankles are wobbly, it's quite difficult in gaiters, and you need to get them high enough under the bum to support under the butt to give them that dynamic stability. And we have several of our better type ones in CAFOs. We probably have about 8 of them or 10 of them now, and they're doing incredibly well in CAFOs. Some of them are actually walking in them. A lot of them stand and balance well. And we've had 2 new ones recently in the last 2 or 3 weeks who stood in them fantastically, balanced, no problem at all, could balance hands-free. And so if you want them to do more work, you've got to get them out of a standing frame. The dynamic stander is the most work you can do in a standing frame. Otherwise, you need to come out of the standing frame for at least part of the time.
Okay. What's the best stander for adults?
There are several different standards for adults. The biggest problem for adult standing is getting into a stander. So you've got 3 options. You have either a stander that gets you up to standing, and there are a couple, where you literally drive into the stander. There's a belt that comes behind your bum, and the mechanism will lift you into the stander from this belt under your bottom. The second option, if you can't be hoisted into a standing frame, or the standing frame doesn't get you up automatically, is a standing wheelchair. Now, standing wheelchairs we know are incredibly expensive, and if you are not going to use them effectively, they are a waste of time and money. They are incredibly heavy, particularly if you have a standing wheelchair that you want to drive, so that you drive in the standing position, because they've got to counterbalance your weight. So they are incredibly heavy pieces of machinery. They don't have a very small turning circle, so you need plenty of space for them. There are 2 mechanisms for standing wheelchairs. There's the one that comes straight from sitting to standing. So you're literally sitting and the seat raises and you stand up. The second mechanism, which I think was on the Boulder, but we all know that Boulder, who are now ETAC, went bust and suddenly reappeared apparently. But on the Boulder, you went into flat, you went into recline, full recline, and then the whole lot came up from there. Now that actually is a better way of doing it, but it's a still more expensive chair. And not only is it more expensive, it seemed to have more problems because it used to break down more often. But the idea is, instead of just raising your bottom and pushing you up into standing, that it reclined you, so you were a bit like in a supine stander like this one. So you were in that reclined position, and then the whole lot came up to standing, which, as I say, was actually a better way of doing it rather than just your bottom coming up, because you could get straighter and stand. The other thing you have to think about standing wheelchairs is sometimes when you sit down, you've slipped and you're not in quite the same position. You also need to make sure, if you want to stand, you keep the knee blocks in, because some of the people who have standing wheelchairs don't like the knee blocks in unless they're going to stand, and then somebody needs to come along and have the knee blocks. So if you've moved from where, say, you live into school or work or wherever, and you haven't brought your knee blocks, then you can't stand up. Some of them have chest blocks as well. Some of them just have a strap around the top. Some people want more support, but that's the standing wheelchair. And then the third option, which more people seem to be using, if you have, certainly if you've got a ceiling track hoist, but it will work with a good portable hoist, is the standing sling, so that you can stand in a sling and take some weight through your feet. Now, admittedly, you're not doing quite as much work, but on the other hand, then you can kick and you can move around, and you've got more freedom and mobility in a standing sling. So these are all possibilities as an adult for standing.
Okay, what's your opinion on the Innova walk? Is that what it's called?
Inno walk.
Yeah.
The Inno walk. Okay, well, interesting, because I wasn't going to do much on exercise equipment because it's not strictly about exercise. The Inno walk, I was on a webinar just less than 2 weeks ago on the Inno walk. I don't think it builds up a lot of power in the weakest of children. I haven't been convinced that the machine isn't doing all the work, because the settings on the machine for the weakest of people, I actually think is quite passive, that the machine does the work and the kids aren't doing it. But if you are working, the position that you're working in is a nice position, so that the pushing is knee extension, as long as you are not pushing your feet into plantar flexion, because obviously we don't want feet down. So ideally, if you're using an inner walk, you've got foot splints on, because otherwise the temptation is to point your toes down, which is a real negative from an SMA point of view. We don't want to strengthen those muscles that point your feet down. Those are your plantar flexors. So if you're going to use an inner walk, you should have foot splints on, so that you're really using a nice knee hip extension position. And I have seen it recently, and I do think it can help. I think it's got to be set up properly by people who understand SMA, although the inner walk people say they do understand SMA and have SMA kids in them. The price has come down dramatically. They were originally £30,000. They're now £15,000, but it's still a lot of money. But I think the inner walk can be a positive exercise machine, but it's big and it's expensive. So it's not a bad one. If the alternatives for children are the spider cage, which I really don't like. I know a lot of East Europeans and East European therapists in the UK use the spider cage. I think it exercises all the wrong muscles. I know I've seen some of our kids in them. I know we've had one particular very strong SMA one who was developing hip flexion contractures in them. Mum says, isn't this fantastic? I said, no, actually it's really not, because the people who are using it do not understand that the kids are using the wrong muscles. But the inner walk, I do think, has quite a nice hip extension, knee extension. Need to make sure you're using the right muscles. Need to make sure the machine's not doing it all for you. And the settings can be that it can be quite passive, which is fine. It'll improve, in theory, your bone health, but it may not in adults. The bone health really needs some help in adults. It can improve your joint mobility, it can improve your circulation, but if it won't be improving your power if the machine's doing all the work for you. But I'm more convinced about the inner walk more recently, but as I say, not necessarily for the weakest of children where the machine's doing all the work. And again, with an adult, as you are an adult and you can feel what it's doing, you should be able to feel that you're doing some of the work.
Okay, we've got another one saying, is there anything other than AFOs to wear inside shoes to support the ankles?
Yes, there's plenty of things that you can use. The two things we use are something called SMAFOs, which are super malleolar ankle foot orthotics, but they only work if you can get your foot to 90 degrees. So you can use them, but as I say, you have to be able to get your foot to 90 degrees to use them effectively. So that is 90 degrees, the neutral position. And they really are just to stop your hind foot twisting. Now, people don't often understand the anatomy of the foot. Everybody talks about the ankle as though it's the whole foot. The ankle is one joint, and actually it's probably one of the least important joints of your feet. The ankle moves your foot up and down, and that is it. Underneath your ankle is a much more important joint. That is your subtalar joint. And your subtalar joint is the one that controls your heel and the twist of your foot in and out. And we know that young children with SMA very often twist their foot out, which is unusual. The vast majority of children with any disabilities twist their foot in, but a lot of our kids twist their foot outwards, and the subtalar joint is the one that controls that movement in and out of the foot. The ankle is literally up and down. So SMAFOs, these supramalleolar orthoses, John Florence himself used to call them sandals for some strange reason. Or we use a lot of tri-lock splints, particularly for the type 3s. We like the tri-lock splint. Again, it's very much more about control of the hind foot and the midfoot, and not so much the ankle. But if you've got a very tight ankle that's pointing down, you don't have a lot of choice. You either wear nothing, which is better, because a lot of the splints do not control what's going on at the ankle apart from the AFOs. And we don't advocate trying to walk in AFOs because it's not the right pattern of walking. Some of the type 3s may use AFOs, but it's not common. There is another orthosis called a leaf spring, but you have to be a walker to use a leaf spring. And a leaf spring helps you pull your toes up. You have to be a walker and a reasonably good walker to use a leaf spring splint. So there are other foot options other than AFOs for controlling the foot.
Okay, this is going back to seating, but I've only just seen the question.
That's fine.
My son, who is type 1, age 4, is learning to drive his mini salsa power chair. He is needing a different seat pad. His OT has recommended a contoured seat. Do you have any advice?
A contoured seat is basically one that's molded to him. And it's very, very difficult to know. If he's learning to drive his wheelchair, I'm assuming he's got reasonable head control, he's got reasonable sitting control. I think, not having seen him, then his OT has to be the one that decides. And also the mini salsa has to accept this as a good thing. It needs to make sure that it doesn't hold him to the point where he finds it more difficult to access the joystick unless the joystick has been made central, that he has some mobility, because driving is not about keeping still. You don't keep completely still when you're driving, you do move around a little bit, and it's got to be comfortable. But the most important thing when you're driving is that your arms are not restricted by a molded seat, because if you're restricted, one of the things about it is you've got to be able to maintain, and this is the hardest thing for a lot of the type 1s, is maintain that smooth push on a joystick. And this is what they often can't. We often get this push, 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 jerk, jerk, jerk. And again, if you restrict the arm and they can't get that smooth push, you're going to have difficulty. But you need to go with your OT, because obviously I don't know the child. I don't know what difficulties or otherwise they have. We do know that molded seats or contoured seating can be a little bit more difficult to get in and out of, just getting your hands in underneath them. And also, again, if they have a spinal jacket, you need to make sure that the two are compatible, because jackets and molded seats aren't always compatible.
Okay, we've got another one saying, can I use a dynamic stander with CAFOs?
The question has to be why. I have a big problem with people standing in standing frames and CAFOs. You're talking about £1,700 worth of CAFOs inside a standing frame. If a standing frame works, it shouldn't need CAFOs. That's the top and bottom of it. I really cannot see why anybody should be wearing CAFOs inside a standing frame, a dynamic stander, any sort of stander. If a stander is a good stander, then you should not need CAFOs. Maybe gaiters, but even then, my honest feeling is, if the right stander is with the right child, you do not need anything on your legs. The biggest problem we have with all equipment, and I hate to say this, but it's true, we have a one-size-fits-all policy these days. The team have certain pieces of equipment, and it's not a case of the equipment fitting your child, it's a case of your child fitting what they have in stock or what they're prepared to give you. So you have to fit the child to the stander or the piece of equipment or even the seat sometimes, and we wiggle and jiggle and stick pads in here, there and everywhere to make your child fit the equipment, rather than finding a piece of equipment that fits your child. But I cannot see any reason why any child in a good stander should need CAFOs in the standing frame. You should not need them. CAFOs are for freestanding, not for standing in standing frames.
Okay, can adults wear CAFOs?
Most definitely, yes. I have several adults in CAFOs. The question is where you're going to get them. And I only know a couple of manufacturers and orthotics teams who will make CAFOs for adults. Now, John Florence will make CAFOs for any adult for whom they made them as a child. but they will not take on new adults that I am aware of. But if you've had SMA and you have had your CAFOs from John Florence throughout your childhood, they will continue to make your CAFOs as an adult, because in theory, there is not much difference between a 15 and 16-year-old and an adult. So they're just doing the same thing. And we have several people who still go to John Florence as adults, but they are not an adult service. They are a pediatric service. Now, I know Peacocks in Newcastle will make them. And as far as I'm aware, they will make them for adults. And there are a couple of other services, but generally, people don't make CAFOs. I know of several physios around the country who don't even approve of us putting the kids in CAFOs. I have been told off by many physios saying CAFOs are a waste of time, which is quite difficult because we believe exactly the opposite, and we would never stop trying to put our kids into CAFOs. But I know there are services up and down the country where they don't agree with CAFOs and don't use them. Whether that's because they don't have an amazing orthotic service as we do, or whether they just feel that everybody should just get on with sitting in a wheelchair, which I don't believe in. Particularly with new treatments, everybody needs to be as active as possible. In lockdown, where we've had multiple problems with keeping people active, then we want the CAFOs, we want the activity, we want the standing, we want the balance, we want everything that goes with the CAFOs. But finding a service that will make adult CAFOs, finding an adult neurologist or GP who will refer you for CAFOs becomes a little bit problematic. But I would speak to your neuromuscular consultant if you want CAFOs as an adult and see if it's possible through the adult neuromuscular service. It's unlikely that a DGH would be able to make CAFOs for somebody with a neuromuscular problem.
Okay, can you use CAFOs if you've already got knee contractures?
Yes, but it depends how big your knee contractures are. And it's not just about knee contractures. We can accommodate possibly 20, 25 degrees of knee flexion contracture. But if you've got severe hip flexion contractures or plantar flex feet, that your feet don't come to neutral, there is a formula that John Florence used where they add the hip flexion contracture, the knee flexion contracture, and the foot position together, and there is a limit to what you can achieve. But knee flexion contractures on their own, several of our kids have had quite marked knee flexion contractures and still managed to stand in CAFOs.
Okay, are like the parallel rehab parallel bars good to use while in CAFOs, or does it cause people to put too much weight on their arms instead of on their legs?
No, not necessarily. When we teach people to, when our kids get CAFOs, the first thing we teach them to do is balance independently. We don't try and give them walking frames or walking. We don't put them in parallel bars. We play bubbles. Well, we can't during lockdowns. Blooming hard to blow bubbles with a mask on, but we blow bubbles, we play, we stand them at the plinth, we have toys, we have throwing, catching, all the things. We want them to balance independently, because without independent standing balance, very hard to progress to walking with whatever we walk with. Now, when we teach the kids to walk, we always use the frames that go behind them, what is called a posture control walker. And we were going to get onto that with mobility, and we've got onto it with sitting, with standing. Let me write that one down because that's important. It's a posture control walker, and it's a very simple concept. It goes behind you because it keeps you more upright. That is a posture control walker. And the reason we do that is when you are standing, if you have a frame or a rollator in front of you and you put your arms there and you take your weight there, it is almost impossible when your weight is forward on your arms like that to move your legs. It is almost impossible to actually get the movement to move your legs, so that when the frame is behind you and you are upright and your arms are in line with your body, it is much easier then to bring your legs forward. So we always use the frames that go behind. We do not use the frames that go in the front. But when you are using parallel bars, it's absolutely fine as long as you do not put your arms too far in front of you onto the bars, but use them as you would a posture walker, and keep your arms pretty much beside where your body is. What you don't want to do is lean your arm and your upper trunk onto your arms. You need to stay upright, but in CAFOs, you should stay upright anyway, because the actual CAFOs come all the way up to the bones in your bum, and those bones in your bottom should be sitting on the back of the CAFOs. And that's why we do the independent standing, to teach the kids to sit on those sections at the back, get their trunk upright, because that's the most effective way of them being able to move your legs forward. If you're leaning forwards, and you can do it yourself and think about it, you're in that position, much harder to actually move your legs. Now, the other thing for some of the type 3s and the better type 2s, and it really is a strong 2 that would manage this, you can do crutches, but you would have to, again, make sure that you're quite upright when you're using them. Generally, most people prefer the posture control walker, but I've had some better type 2s and non-ambulant 3s who've used CAFOs with crutches.
Okay, thank you. I think we'll call it there, shall we?
Oh my goodness.
We're part 2 of this one in September, maybe?
Yes, I think next time we're doing returning to school. I have a funny feeling. Yes, because we only got halfway through again today. So sorry, everybody. We were going to do equipment. We've got as far as mobility, and there is still lots to do. Keep the questions coming. We will try and answer them, but we will make part 2 of equipment as soon as possible. Thanks, Marnie.
Okay, thank you, Marion.
Night.
We just want to remind everyone that it is obviously Awareness Month, so we have got talks going on all the way through the month. So our next talk is Wednesday with Maria Cristina Scotto, and she is going to be updating us on research, trials and therapeutic approaches, as well as doing a Q&A. So we will see you on Wednesday.
Lovely. Thanks, Marnie. Bye.